Hi, friends. A quick welcome to everyone who has recently started to listen to the show and has joined our spooky Haunted Talks family. The response to the last few episodes has been overwhelming. We are so thankful for each and every one of you and honored that you would choose to spend a little of your time with us in the dark. We wanted to do something a little special for this, our 150th episode. The day this show comes out, March 31st, marks the 101st anniversary of what I consider to be one of the most perplexing and haunting true crime cases we have ever covered, the Hinterkaifeck Murders. Even though it has been 5 years since we first released this episode, I still often think about it and wonder what happened on that isolated farmstead on that fateful and dreadful night. Join me as we go back and listen for footsteps in the attic. Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we thank you for joining us for this episode. Fair warning, my friends, this episode deals with murder. The utterly perplexing and violent deaths of 5 family members and their maid on an isolated farm in Germany on March 31st, 1922. While I will do my best not to sensationalize any elements of the story, there will be some disturbing content. That being said, if you've enjoyed our previous episodes on the Black Donnellys or the Dyatlov Pass incident, you're going to want to listen to this, as it is a mystery as baffling as its violence is shocking.
It's very interesting. Is sort of the forgotten victim of the case is a lady called Maria Baumgartner, who was the sick victim, and she was the maid. And she arrived at the farmstead on the day of the murders, on the day she started work at the farmstead on the day she died.
Joining me will be Edward Chilvers, author of Footsteps in the Attic, a true account of the Slayings at the Hinterkaifeck Farmstead.
Her sister walked with her, brought her to Hinterkaifeck, saw her in through the door, and was walking away when Maria came running out of the farmstead in tears, grabbed hold of her sister, threw her arms around her and would not let her go, and was inconsolable with what seemed to be fear, saying how she didn't want to go back. And her sister persuaded Maria that she had to go back and work for this family. And in the end, Maria calmed down. She did go back into the farmhouse. That was the last time her sister saw her, and she lived with that for the rest of her life. She had persuaded her to go back into the farmhouse to her death.
But before we get to that, do you love ghost stories? Are you intrigued by dark history? Join us on a haunted walk, the ultimate spooky adventure in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. Our expert storytellers will take you on a journey through the city's most haunted locations, sharing chilling tales of ghostly encounters and unexplainable happenings. From haunted jails to forgotten graveyards, the Haunted Walk will transport you to another time and place. Join us on a spine-tingling paranormal adventure. Book your tickets now at hauntedwalk.com. On our website, you can also find information about our online experiences, which can be enjoyed from anywhere in the world. spend an eerie night in with our Haunting at Home online paranormal adventure, or grab a spot around our virtual haunted campfires and hear some of the best storytellers in the world share their favorite creepy stories. Information on our Haunting at Home, virtual haunted campfires, and our in-person ghost tours can be found on our website, hauntedwalk.com. And if you're enjoying our episodes, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us, and we would be honored if you recommend the show to anyone you know who loves things that go bump in the night. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, for the latest updates, new episodes, blog posts, and some finely curated spooky memes.
I myself grew up in Suffolk. I grew up in a farmhouse which was a good half a mile from the next house or the next cottage. So I did sort of relate to the isolation and to the setting. I know what it is to grow up in isolation and where it's quite lonely. And in that sense, I could identify with the location. And secondly, of course, when I heard about the story, I mean, it's just such a fascinating, terrible story, and I think it's made even more terrible by the fact that it's true and the great mystery behind it as well. So I really wanted to sort of look into it, investigate the mystery, and see if I could come up with any answers of my own.
Hinterkaifeck was a small farmstead, approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich. The main L-shaped building on the property would seem a little unusual to us today, as it combined the living quarters for the family and the barn under the same roof, with a dividing wall and doors between them. The attic stretched across the top of both areas without a dividing wall in between, making it possible in the attic to access one area from the other without using any of the doors.
I've looked for it. I've looked for the satellite images. I've studied photos, any trace of it. There is nothing left of the farmstead. There is perhaps the only sign you will see that there was something there was that there is a road which leads to nowhere. There's a road leading up to the woods which then stops, and that would have been the road leading up to the farmstead. I've looked at the satellite image. There is no trace of the farmstead left.
There were 5 family members who lived at the farm at the time of the murders. A 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, who was the patriarch of the family, his 72-year-old wife, Gisela, who was the matriarch of the family. She married Andreas in 1886, less than a year after her first husband of 7 years passed away. Her first marriage produced 4 children, 2 of which died in infancy, and a third was killed in the Great War. Andreas and Gisela had 3 daughters, of whom only one survived to adulthood, Victoria, which means 5 of Gisila's 7 children died early in life. Victoria was in her mid-40s when she was murdered along with her parents at Hinterkaifeck. Victoria's life was a very difficult one. There had long been rumors in the community that her parents were at best negligent and at worst sexually abusive. Some went so far as to suggest that Victoria's sisters had died from malnourishment, even though the family was fairly well off. At the age of 27, Victoria was married to a 26-year-old Carl Gabriel, a farmer's son from a nearby hamlet. The marriage was troubled right from the start, possibly for the reason that the two of them resided at Hinterkaifeck. Carl complained to friends of being dominated and bullied by his new father-in-law, Andreas. It seems likely this contributed to Carl volunteering to go off and fight in the early days of the First World War, only a few months after being married and with a child on the way. Carl Gabriel was never to return to the farm. In December 1941 came news he was missing in action, presumed dead during the Battle of Artois. A month after his death, Victoria gave birth to a daughter named Kazilla, after her grandmother. She's the fourth victim. The final member of the family present, and perhaps the most heartbreaking, was Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph. He was believed to be the product of a brief affair between Victoria and a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. The sixth victim, which you will recall from the opening of the show, was the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only started her job with the family that very day. The first outward signs that there may be something wrong on the farmstead occurred on April 1st, 1922, when young Kazilla, Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, did not show up for school. She was rarely absent. Later that same day, around noon, 2 delivery men arrived at Hinterkaifeck with a coffee order for Victoria. They arrive at the house and find it completely locked up tight. They knock on the doors, shout around, but receive no response. That evening, and as we will come to learn a full day after authorities believed the family was killed, a carpenter that was passing by on his way home made a rather startling observation.
They witnessed the figure of a man outside in the yard in front of the fire, and the smoke from the fire blew over a very acrid smell, and the witness later stated it was sort of like the smell of burning clothes.
On April 2nd, being such a small community, the family's absence from church was very noticeable, particularly Victoria's, as she was a very enthusiastic member of the choir. The following day, on April 3rd, the postman arrives, and he looks through the window to see Joseph's stroller is not in the kitchen, which is unusual. That's the spot where he usually sees it when he drops off the mail. He also noticed that the kitchen door was ajar, and therefore assumed that the family must be somewhere inside. On April 4th, a repairman arrives to fix a diesel engine. He notices the sound of the dog barking, who appears to be shut up in the stables. Otherwise, the house is closed up and in darkness. He knocks and shouts, but gets no response. Not wanting to have to make a return trip back to the farm, he decides to wait under a nearby tree for the family to return. In the distance, near the woods, he sees a man moving in the fields. He assumes it must be Andreas, and he waits. After 20 minutes or so, he loses sight of the figure and gets impatient. He decides to go inside the shed and start working on the engine. He was whistling while he worked and was at it for a few hours and was even testing the engine, which would have been quite loud and echoed across the landscape. Once he finished, he goes looking around the house to see if anyone has returned in the meantime. He notices the barn door is wide open. He finds the family dog tethered outside the entrance. He knew the dog, having been out to the farm several times, but something was clearly wrong. It was barking and snarling at him. As he approached, he noticed a nasty-looking gash across the eyes of the dog, as if it had been slashed with a sharp implement. Unsure what to do next, the repairman heads to the next farm, the Schlittenbauer farm, and he tells the daughters there to relay the message to the Gruber family that the engine has been fixed, as he couldn't find anyone to pass the word to. When Lorenz Schlittenbauer returns later that afternoon and gets the report from his daughters, he immediately sends out his 16- and 9-year-old son to go to the farmstead to see if they can find anyone. The boys knock on doors, windows, and generally make a lot of noise, but they don't see anyone and get no response from the darkened house. Upon hearing the report from his sons, Schlittenbauer becomes quite concerned and goes and fetches 2 neighbors to help him and his sons do a more thorough search of the property. Arriving on the scene, it was the barn that caught their attention. A cow had broken or was set loose and was wandering about. This fact would become very interesting to the authorities, as there were reports about a gang of rural robbers deliberately releasing livestock as a way to lure their victims to the barn. As they made their way deeper inside, they saw blood-stained straw, and a little further on, 4 bodies, half covered under straw, and an old barn door. They were the bodies of Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and her daughter, Kazilia. On a quick visual inspection, each of the family members seemed to have died due to a massive head injury. Of particularly tragic note is that tufts of hair were found in the hands of young Kazilia. This indicates she likely did not die during the initial attack, but held on for minutes or even hours afterwards, pulling her own hair out as a response to the horrific situation she was experiencing. Schlittenbauer rallies everyone to enter the house in the hopes of finding his son, Joseph, alive. When they arrive at the back door, they find a set of keys in the lock, and not just any set of keys, but the set Andreas reported as suddenly missing just a short time before. They head straight to the bedroom Victoria shared with her 2 children and make a vile discovery. Joseph, the 2-year-old child, lay dead in his cot. The top cover of the cot was ripped apart as if a sharp instrument had been randomly crashed through it several times. His body had been left partially covered with one of Victoria's dresses.
The most shocking, most terrible crime, I mean, it's a terrible crime, most terrible aspect of the crime, and one that I think we will still find it hard to fathom, is the murder of the 2-year-old child, Joseph. And you think, well, Joseph was found lying in his cot, he was battered to death in his cot, and you think, well, surely, okay, you can perhaps understand that a murderer who committed a crime of passion would need to silence the adults in the house or the people who might be able to bear witness against him. But a 2-year-old lying asleep in the cot would not have been able to convict the murderer. And so people do ask me, well, what reason was there for killing poor little Joseph? And I don't have an answer for that. I think, I don't have an answer, no.
There was still one more gruesome discovery to be made. In the maid's room, they found the legs of Maria Baumgartner sticking out from under a blanket on the floor. She had also suffered a massive head injury. On her bed was her still unopened suitcase. It would appear she did not have time enough to unpack before she was killed. She was also wearing the same clothes she had arrived in earlier that day. This makes it likely the murders took place a short time after she arrived.
Schlittenbauer's behaviour in the immediate aftermath struck people as bizarre, to say the least, and it was the reason why he was considered the prime suspect and largely ostracised for the rest of his life. His action upon discovering the murders, and remember, one of these victims he had acknowledged as his own son, 2-year-old Joseph. Schlittenbauer sent the other farmers away to fetch the police, whilst he went to feed the pigs of the Gruber family. When the police arrived, they found that Schlittenbauer had taken the pigs back to his own farm. What they also found when they arrived is that Schlittenbauer had gone out into the community, gathered together other villagers, told them of this terrible event that had happened, and had basically led a guided tour of the murder scene. So the police turn up and they find the house has become a tourist attraction, and you've got Schlittenbauer as a sort of curator of this crime scene, showing people around and treating it all like some sort of attraction. Immediately, he raised their suspicions.
The Munich police arrived at 5:30 a.m. the following day. A search of the interior of the barn immediately revealed a pickaxe lying in the feeding trough, which they believed to have been the murder weapon.
That they discovered a pickaxe within the barn, but they noticed that there was no blood on the supposed murder weapon. Their theory for this was that one of the cattle which had escaped, whether by accident or design, had licked the blood away from the murder weapon. Obviously, if we think the problem with that is, let's imagine the pickaxe had fallen down to the side, the cow would lick one side. Would the cow then be able to turn the murder weapon around and lick the blood clean?
Also in the barn, the authorities were surprised to find that the cows had been milked in the past 24 hours, which meant someone had been caring for the animals days after the family's death. In the courtyard, they found signs of digging, as though someone had abandoned digging a hole due to the frigid conditions, and then covered the hole partly up with straw in a half-hearted attempt to conceal it. Inside the home, nothing really seemed rummaged through, as if someone was robbing the place, with the exception of Victoria's bedroom. In Victoria's bedroom, an empty purse was found lying overturned on the bed, and someone had clearly searched through the papers in her room. However, a watch and several envelopes of money had been left untouched. In fact, significant amounts of cash, coins, war bonds, and various items of gold were easily found around the home. If it was a robbery gone wrong, why would someone take the items from Victoria's purse, but leave items of significant value that could have been found with very minimal effort? Even more perplexing is if the killer stayed in the home for days after the murders, with presumably ample time to fully search the home. There were unsettling findings in the cellar and the attic. In the cellar, a pig carcass that the family had used for pork showed clear signs that meat had been taken off of it in the past few days. Detectives believed this was an indication that someone had been eating in the house while the bodies remained in the barn. In the attic, detectives noted depressions in the hay thrown on the floor, as though someone had been lying down in it. There was also a rope hanging from the trap door to the barn door. This led to the conclusion that upon leaving, the killer had locked up the house and then left through the barn. Loose tiles were also discovered in the roof, which allowed someone to look out into the courtyard to see who was approaching. They also discovered bacon rinds as well as human excrement in a corner of the attic. In looking more closely at the barn, there were a few elements that led authorities to believe family members were lured out there one by one. They discovered the doorway from the home to the barn was not very wide and would require a group of people to go through single file. This would make ambushing a group very difficult. However, one at a time, it would be a very effective spot. The police also tested the acoustics in the barn and found that someone screaming or shouting for help could not have been easily heard inside the living area. The clothing of the victims also garnered some interest. The fact that Victoria and her mother were fully clothed made investigators believe they had been killed first. Andreas and young Kazilia were in their underclothes, suggesting they were likely in bed before coming to the barn. As the police began to speak to potential witnesses and members of the community, they began to reconstruct the final days of the Gruber family. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. 6 days before the killings, a neighbor and her daughter found a very upset Victoria crying in the middle of the road near the farm. She was shaking and appeared terrified. She would not tell them why she was so upset, only that she wanted to get away. Around this time, Victoria had also told friends that she had seen a strange man wearing what looked like an army coat, standing ominously at the edge of their field as if watching the house. As retold by multiple witnesses, on March 30th, a day before the murders, Andreas observed some very unusual things around the property.
Andreas comes downstairs one morning. He finds a newspaper on the table. The newspaper was that of a newspaper in Munich. Munich was 70 miles away. There was certainly nobody in his family who had been to Munich in the last few days and who would have bought a newspaper and then have just left it lying on the table. He goes outside and he finds that the lock to one of his outhouses has been broken. Somebody has been inside. Nothing's been taken, so he assumes maybe just vagrants or maybe he disturbed them. He can't find his front door key. it's gone missing. He goes out to mend one of his fences, and this being winter in Bavaria, he sees footprints in the snow. And what is interesting about the footprints, there's one set of footprints which lead up to the house. There are no sets of footprints which are leading away.
After hearing this story, one of the neighbors offered Andreas a gun and suggested calling the police, which Andreas flat out refused, saying, "I am not afraid." When he returns back to the farmstead, Andreas finds a cow has gotten loose, or has been set loose, and apparently this really shook him. Perhaps the most terrifying part of an awful story is that night, as the family lay in their beds, they could hear the sounds of footsteps coming from the attic above them. The next morning, at first light, Andreas decides to go up to the attic and see what or whom is up there. He finds straw strewn on the floor, but does not find anyone. Later that day, he and Victoria go into town to do some shopping and relay these strange events to two shopkeepers in two different stores. This is the last time that they, or anyone living on the farmstead, would be seen alive. An obvious question here is why, after discovering a newspaper from 70 kilometers away in his house, a suddenly missing set of keys, a broken lock, and footsteps leading to, but not away from his property, and ultimately hearing the sound of someone walking around in his attic during the night, why didn't Andreas ever go to the police? The answer is not simple, and takes us down another dark and twisted path.
Perhaps it's best explained by considering that Andreas himself had lots of skeletons in his cupboard. He was a tyrant. He was somebody who was committing terrible crimes against his own family, in particular his own daughter. So if he were to summon the authorities, would it not be possible that either his wife, or particularly Victoria, might see the authority figure, might see the police officer coming into the house and think, well, at last I can be free of my father, I can denounce my father, I can report his crimes, and I can cause a lot of trouble for him. So I wonder if perhaps Andreas was worried about law enforcement coming into his house for that reason.
A few months after Victoria gave birth to Joseph, a sordid secret exploded into the open when a maid walked into a bedroom to find Andreas having sex with Victoria, his 35-year-old daughter. The maid immediately informed the police. Andreas and Victoria were both arrested, and in May 1915, convicted of incest. Andreas was sentenced to a year in prison, Victoria to 1 month. The revelation sent shockwaves throughout the small community and cast a shadow on the family and Andreas in particular that would persist until their deaths. This revelation also prompted many to question the parentage of both of Victoria's children, Kazilia and Joseph. Before we start considering a few of the suspects, there is one other element of the police investigation worth mentioning. Before the bodies of the family were released for burial, and with no strong leads in the case, the police took the unusual step of removing each of the heads of the victims and sending them to a clairvoyant to see if the crime could be solved psychically.
A clairvoyant suggested that the culprit was a big, broad-shouldered man, somebody with their hair combed backwards. They pictured the house, and crucially, the psychic concluded that the murder weapon was still concealed somewhere in the property. During the demolition of the house a year later, following a dispute over the inheritance of the property, a weapon, a blunt instrument, was found concealed within the rafters of the property that may perhaps have been the murder weapon. I mean, obviously, in a farmhouse, anyone growing up in a farmhouse will tell you there were all kinds of tools that you will find, but I think the thing with this one is that it had been or appeared to have been concealed within the rafters or the floorboards, and was only located when the house was in the process of being demolished.
The prime suspect in the case has long been considered to be Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had a brief affair with Victoria. When she became pregnant with her second child, around the same time, Andreas demanded money from Schlittenbauer for the upkeep of his child that he had fathered. Schlittenbauer absolutely refused paternity and even accused the child of being Andreas's. This led to very bad feelings between the families for quite some time, and at one point Andreas even chased him off his property with a pitchfork. Eventually, Schlittenbauer admitted to paternity and paid support for the child, and relations between the family did seem like they improved. But could this be the motive for such a heinous crime? While the money was substantial, Schlittenbauer was reasonably well off and had recently gotten married. And would he harbor a grudge so fierce that he would kill the entire family a few years later? While Schlittenbauer had a complicated history with the family and acted somewhat strangely in the hours that followed the discovery of the bodies, which really prompted the suspicion about him, to consider him a suspect, we would need to believe that this man who had openly claimed Joseph as his own would have the ability to kill the 2-year-old in cold blood.
That is the question. I think that probably police thought the same thing, and that, coupled with the fact that police simply didn't believe he was the sort of man who was capable of committing the murder. I suppose if you were looking for a motive, we might speculate that he'd been having an affair with Victoria. He had recently married the previous year, and so perhaps, maybe if the affair was going on, who knows, maybe the affair had carried on with Victoria and things came to a head. Maybe he had an argument with Andreas or Victoria or somebody who was threatening to expose him, and he committed this crime of passion and then decided that to protect himself, he couldn't leave anybody else alive. But certainly when he was interviewed for the crime, although the police didn't find him very convincing and thought that perhaps he had lied in some way to protect his reputation, they didn't see him as a murderer. He just didn't strike them as the sort of person who could have committed this sort of crime.
If not Schlittenbauer, who might have done this? Perhaps the next likely suspect would be someone completely unknown to us and the family. Some random vagrant or homeless person, as this was not long after the First World War and Germany was definitely on hard economic times. Could have been a passerby who somehow committed these acts. What makes that hard to believe is the fact that so many of the valuables and so much money was left in easily found places in the home, but was not disturbed. If someone was there for multiple days, a really terrible character, if they can stomach killing an entire family, why would they not take all the valuables as well? Because there were so few suspects, it led to some really outlandish people being considered, and perhaps none more so than Victoria's first husband, Carl Gabriel. Now, this line of questioning didn't really take hold until about 10 years after the murders, and really tied into the comments Victoria made about seeing someone wearing what looked like an army coat around the periphery of the forest. As you will recall, Carl Gabriel supposedly died on the front lines during the Battle of Artois, so police actually did push this investigation further on to see if perhaps he didn't really die and had somehow snuck back to Germany and back to the farmstead, and perhaps upset about the incestuous behavior and relationship that had been exposed, he murdered the entire family out of anger and disgust. Well, while considerable went effort into researching this particular theory, it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Carl Gabriel had died during the war. One of his old school friends actually saw his corpse and right away knew it was him. In fact, he even searched his pockets and found a photo of Victoria in them. Some speculate that he might have spoke about the wealth of Hinterkaifeck to some of the other soldiers, and that may have provided motive for someone else after the war to come back looking to get money. But again, why leave the money behind? And why take such a drastic step to kill the whole family, including the 2-year-old? Over the years, many people have been arrested and held for very short periods of time in relation to the case. There's been many deathbed confessions, in fact. One involves the sister of Adolf Gump, who on her deathbed in 1945 had confessed that in 1951, Adolf and her brother Anton had committed the murders. It is true that at the time they had been working as laborers in a nearby farm, but ultimately there was not enough evidence. After pondering this case, I'm stuck with one of three options. The killer was either someone that the Gruber family knew intimately well, someone that Andreas would not be afraid of if he thought they were in the attic, or it was someone who had some acquaintance with the family. There were reports of two brothers who would often stop by and kind of harass one of the family's earlier maids, propositioning her. In fact, Andreas at one point even tried to scare him off his farm, shooting a gun up into the air. Is it possible these two roguish and petty criminal brothers could have committed such a terrible act? The last category would be an individual or individuals who did not know the family at all, the random passers-by, the vagrants, transient people. And in my mind, I'm trying to consider which of those three options, someone who knew them well, someone who sort of knew them, and someone who didn't know them at all. And I'm trying to decide which of those three options I find more frightening. Given how much time has passed in this case, it seems unlikely we will ever know for certain what happened that terrible night on the Hinterkaifeck Farmstead.
You look at the case and you look at the evidence, and you can see even you can see that over 90 years ago, just how primitive the police investigation techniques were. And if there are any positives for us 95 years later, 96 years later, it is that a crime of this nature committed under the same circumstances, with our knowledge of crime scene investigation, treatment of a crime scene, DNA technology, it's a crime that you would think would be solved very quickly. A crime of this nature is unlikely to go unsolved for very long. I don't think there'll be any more Hinterkaifecks.
Thank you so much for joining us. For information about our in-person ghost tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, as well as our online experiences, including the haunting at home and our virtual haunted campfires, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. Be sure to follow the show wherever you listen so you know when the new episodes come out. And if you have a moment, if you could leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.